Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, the internationally recognized artist Tom Joyce. Tom is formally trained, he's a formally trained blacksmith whose works include sculptures, drawings, photographs, and mixed media installations through which he examines the environmental, political, and historical implications of humans using iron in economic and conflict contexts. Tom's received, of course, as you might expect, a number of significant fellowships and awards, including a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship in 2003, and he was inducted into the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art in 2004. He's exhibited internationally, and his work can be found in many permanent collections, including the Museum of Art and Design in New York, the Smithsonian, and Minneapolis and Detroit Institutes of Art. And a recent public commission includes a sculpture forged from the World Trade Center steel for the new National September 11 Memorial Museum. Now, in addition to his numerous accomplishments as an artist, Tom has an impressive and amazingly well-curated collection of African iron and copper alloy currencies. And he's going to discuss some of these today, and some of them will be on view along with some other great currencies by artists tonight at the Santa Fe Institute at the cocktail reception, so please join us for that. And finally, I'll add, as a final note before we bring Tom up, that I had the pleasure of visiting Tom at his studio, and it's here in Santa Fe. And the thing that's interesting about the studio is that at least for me, it's as interesting as the works that are produced in it. And so in that way, it's a bit like the Santa Fe Institute. So Tom, please join us.
All right. So actually today something quite special happened, and in Anne-Marie Boutillot's in my life. Sorry to bring up a personal thing right up front, but the most valuable thing in her pocket right now is a green card that was just awarded today. And more valuable than gold, I can assure you. But at any rate, I'd like to dedicate this talk to that process, working with USCIS and Homeland Security, and it was, it was almost a painless process. So, at any rate, here we are. I began blacksmithing when I was 14 up in El Rito, about 50 miles north of here. And I knew by the time I was 16 that this was really my life's calling. I worked with a man who had a print shop set up, and I was working with him to set type and feed paper, small edition books, and we had a little newspaper for the Espanola Valley, and it was a very telling moment, you know, in my life, working both with print media and recognizing the value of the printed word, and also repairing the industrial presses that he worked with. These 19th century foot-operated Chandler and Price printing presses required constant maintenance. We had to make new parts. So he had a blacksmithing shop set up to be able to replicate those parts. So it was like an industrial design course that I had at the beginning, as opposed to going about the learning of the profession through more conventional means, like through horseshoeing or whatnot. This was a very specific kind of training that taught me how to forge to dimension, and also I was able to recognize the value of reintroducing old pieces of machinery, knowing that through the hand skills one would learn that you could re-implement those in a modern context and be able to provide for a small farming community something that was quite valuable in terms of the communicative aspect of what the print media brought into it. So I've actually created two, let's see, let me make sure, there we are. There are three things that occurred early on and that have informed the work from the very beginning. And I wanted to show you those, and kind of as a segue into the African material, because it is, to me, the kind of commerce that is it's the currency in my life that was offered at critical moments that I felt were instrumental in how it is that I've taken a certain trajectory in my own work. The first thing was when I was 14, I ran across in the field near our home this patched hoe. And this hoe was repaired 7 times by the village smith there in El Rito. It was a valued object not only for the agricultural endeavor that he was involved in, but it had also come from the East Coast through a catalog. It wasn't forged in his community. It was brought in through mail order, so there was a financial cost to him, and he allowed it to last, could be for the rest of his life. I don't know the story behind the hoe, only reading it in terms of the 7 patches. It was 7 different moments that it wore to the point that he needed to restore it to usefulness again. What that taught me was about the frugality of a person's place in the world, the way we thought about the materials, and giving something that maybe is taken for granted, iron that seems to be pretty plentiful in our world. It was actually a precious commodity to him, and this was very instrumental to me in understanding why the village farmers brought their own iron to me to be able to make into the objects that they might desire during those 3 years that I worked in El Rito. Was quite stunning, actually. And then the second piece that has informed the work all the way through was the very first African currency form I found in the Santa Fe flea market about 30 years ago. And this hoe currency was made by the Mamuye people. It's called Tajare, and it's a bride wealth currency. So it means that it's a special use currency that's only offered as part of a marriage ceremony. And it's what the groom offers to the bride's father in exchange for her hand in marriage, because there's a recognition that inside her family she has this value that is irreplaceable, in that when she leaves not only the labor that she would have produced behind, but she also leaves the potential for children also to be inhabiting this place. There's many other aspects of her life that inside her birth family's home that she provides, that the groom must offer an equivalent value towards that, extracting her out of that household. This bar currency rather is made entirely from hoes. So you can see over on the left-hand side are 2 unused hoes that would have been worked until basically all that was left was the tang. And instead of it being repaired by the smith, like the piece that I showed you previously, in Mamuye communities, they believe that every time the hoe hits the ground, it takes on life force. It basically accrues in value over the fact that it is making contact with the ground. There's also a value applied towards the hand labor that the farmer is toiling in the fields, and that has also a recognized empowerment inside the iron itself. So rather than repair it, they save it, and the family will put together a number of these hoes. When the first son is at marriable age, those hoes are brought to the smith in their village, and they're forged into this shape. So you can see the layers. The folded layers are the multiple hoes that were put together to talk about how this young man was trained well by his own family. He was taught efficient means of farming. He would be able in turn then to provide for her and in turn her family as well because of the farming methods that he employs. So this currency actually is a proof. It's a living proof that he was trained. It's also a store of material, so it has inherent value in that in the bride's father's hands, he can then take it to the smith and it can be forged to whatever else her family desires. And the other part that is intriguing about this in terms of multiple layers of understanding how value is added to a specific kind of currency is the fact that this folded form is actually pregnant with potential. I mean, from a design standpoint, that fattened center in the middle holds all the potential that hopefully in this union between the two, the man and the wife, and the children that they'll bring into the world, and hopefully the changes that those children will also, it's exponential in terms of what that value add is. And so it's represented symbolically in this swelled potential. It also is balanced in a way that you have the male and female aspect implied in that currency. So for me, what was instrumental is the fact that that this bar that could have been very easily overlooked as just a fragment of rusty material instead had this very deep and calculated value inside the community from which it had come. The third thing is recognizing also as a blacksmith and as an artist that uses materials that the very fact that those materials are on my shelf is provisory that somewhere in the world someone has staked a claim and has dug a deep pit, and generally it's cheap labor that has been involved in extracting those resources to be able to provide me with the bar stock that I don't take for granted in my own shop, but is plentifully available to me. And in thinking about the resources that are extracted, it changed the way that I thought about how I might approach my own work in the studio. So these next slides are to share with you the earliest and the latest of these two projects that incorporated objects that other people donated for the making of the work. This is a baptismal font for the first Catholic church to be constructed in Santa Fe in 35 years, the Santa Maria de la Paz Catholic community. And I asked the parishioners to donate pieces of iron that they could tell me a story about, anything that they could recollect, something that was key or critical or important in their own lives. And an archivist from the Museum of International Folk Art, Robin Gavin, came and recorded those stories. We photographed every one of the pieces and created a document that recognized the importance of this iron drive and what it was that people had held in their possession with so much value and yet were willing to offer it up in the same way as has been the case for millennia, really, where people in a community offer up metal to be able to be made into something that the community then would benefit from. So here there were, well, without going into much detail, I mean, there was like a key from Nazareth that one of the nuns had found when she was asking the question, shall I become a nun or not? And there's this key on the pavement that she took as a sign of the decision that she was about to make. The parish priest had his car jack from a Nash Metropolitan that he'd kept in his closet after seminary, after he'd sold the car. But 20 years later, he offers this jack up, and I don't know why he kept the jack. It was symbolic of something in his youth. We can only speculate. But nonetheless, it was interesting to see this kind of patchwork that became the matrix of this community, so that the babies were baptized in the ancestry of this particular community. And these objects held no intrinsic value to anyone else other than to the person who held them for that time. The most recent was a project dedicated just this year in May, and it was the National September 11 Memorial Museum, where I was asked to forge World Trade Center steel into a quote by Virgil that says, "No day shall erase you from the memory of time." This is Hangar 17 at JFK Airport, where all the steel, tridents, and all kinds of other material was stored while the museum was being built. These were artifacts that at that time were absolutely priceless to the families that had lost loved ones during the collapse. In fact, it was interesting from an economic standpoint when the buildings collapsed, they needed to get rid of the material very quickly, and so the Port Authority decided that they would ship to China the steel. There was a need for steel in China, so they were willing to pay top dollar for all the iron, and they shipped, I think it was hundreds and hundreds of tons of material there before they realized that they had also shipped things that should have been a part of the museum, and including like an Alexander Calder that it was crushed out in the front plaza that was cut apart for scrap. And in the end, it was 5 years later, 6, 7 years later, that they ended up buying back this material at a premium, of course. It had escalated in value some 600% since the plus shipping to get it back, including the Calder. But the pieces were taken and then forged and folded back against themselves. And the quote then was 100 feet long, forged from 5,000 pounds of World Trade Center steel. And during the 6 years that I was involved in the project, even though it was designed in an afternoon, as you know, the building took a long time to get out of the ground and be finished. There was a kind of backdoor understanding of the commerce of tragedy, also the commerce of what's behind how soon people can talk about how much is enough to spend for the honoring of those lost. So it was a very fascinating aspect from an anthropological standpoint about how one deals with a tragic event so close to that moment. Yeah, the escalating of what everything was worth. So for the last 12 years, I've been working in a factory outside of Chicago and using the material refuse of, it's actually not even refuse, it's the offspring of the parent that was forged for an industrial purpose that's somewhere in the world. And I wanted to include these slides because it's basically the economic driver for the global economic scene, in that it's palpable, the pulse that one feels inside this place, where when extractive industries are at a high point, when oil is high at the pump, when there's a desire for more copper, more potash, more whatever happens to be mined in extractive industries, then this place is a kind of barometer of what's happening in the economic world. And so I choose to work there with the offspring to be able to recognize the complexity of what that represents inside an industrial forge, where most people don't realize how indispensable blacksmiths still are on this large scale to be able to produce the products that we take for granted in buying, whether it's our clothing, whether it's paper mills, offshore drilling rigs, objects for the Mars rover. In fact, a lot of the defense contracts, all of that is really key. So the first project I worked on when I arrived was, I recognized that everything that they made, like a big gear blank, for instance, that had a hole in the middle, they punch a slug out of the center of it, which is what you can see here. This is in the process of making one of my sculptures that you'll see at the end of the slides. But this one, so it's basically taking the heart out of everything that is made for these industrial uses. And I took each one of those cylindrical slugs and forged them into a rock-like shape and created a depression in them where there's soil samples from all over the world, from battlefields all over the world, that are given as kind of a global project where anyone that I know, anytime I give a lecture, I speak about the participatory aspect where a person could donate a tablespoon of soil from a place near them, sending information about that battlefield to be able to come back and create this iron cairn that eventually will make up thousands of pieces. And the idea here was also just thinking about the way that blacksmiths, what happened in the world when the human fist extended beyond the blow, beyond our reach, with sticks and stones. When metal ended up in the equation, things accelerated to such a degree that it's phenomenal when you imagine the history of metals exploration, when you imagine the history of the offensive and defensive aspects of protecting our borders. And blacksmiths are always at the source. They're always at the critical cutting edge of technological innovations. And we don't realize it. We think when you say the word blacksmith, you don't believe they're still around, but they're absolutely indispensable. You pull the rug out from under that industry, and the world as we know it is really finished. I wanted to leave you, before going into the African material, with a few recent projects too. So this one was for the Museum of Arts and Design. It's 20,000 pounds of stainless steel. Each one of the components, even though they're soft and inviting and people sit on them and hang out on Broadway and Columbus Circle, they also, each one, are made from a component that has to do with these industrial aspects that would be very arresting if one knew exactly what it was that they were in contact with. In the world of design, I felt it was really important to have those kind of components as a part of these sculptures. Another example, 45,000 pounds of stainless steel taken as a parent is being forged, then I retrieve the offspring and forge it into these squished cubes. Another one called Berg, which refers to the tip of the iceberg, that its parent is now out in the world doing its job, and that the offspring was kept by me, severed 4 times, turned 120 degrees, turned up on end and squished until it was almost to the breaking point, to talk about this kind of complexity of the fragility and strength that we apply to these materials. We're hoping that they hold up under stress. We're hoping that they hold back intruders from our borders, but ultimately this material is as fragile as the engineers who have conceived of their design. So the currency of this kind of thought process, human labor, the cutting edge of what it is that one brings to the design equation, all key aspects that keep our economy buoyant. In my own studio here in Santa Fe, I save all of the steel cuttings and the lathe swarf, the drill cuttings, all of that as kind of a DNA of a practice of 45 years, so that when I make a piece in cast iron, there's always an infusion of a certain amount of that material, so that if there was such a thing as the DNA of a material of a practice inside a studio, then it would be tied up in the molecular structure of this component. I wanted to share with you one project that we just installed and dedicated in October last month in a museum, the Mint Museum in Charlotte, North Carolina. And the idea was to think about hammers as being emblematic of a creative process, but also very, very simple, and that in the hands of artists and designers, what it is that we conceive with these simple tools is something that really drives the world, whether it's a piece of art or and creating the art market that is as wild and fluctuating as we know, or inside the world of making the practical things that we use on a daily basis. It's all key, and tools are always at the source of that activity. So the idea was to create a nucleus of those hammers, the hammer that I use the most frequent, and the hammer then was infused with 45 years of other kinds of materials, so it's a unique alloy. And through the eyes of the handle of the hammer, instead of wooden handles, there's stainless rods that extend out in all directions from it. And those are held in place with set screws, but then additional nuclei are added to those in an ever more complex way, creating a kind of interdependence where they become so dense and held in a kind of tension that there's no other mechanical fastener that holds them in place. It's simply the weaving of the bars connecting with one another in more and more places to be able to create this form that holds up on its own, but if you took apart any element in it, it would become weaker with each step. It was also to teach, or not to teach, but to talk about in this museum, it was the melding of 2 different museums, one dedicated to craft and one dedicated to art, which I've always had, well, I just don't believe that there is this kind of polarity that often is in that discussion. And so I decided to make a piece of sculpture that was one, a dense enough thicket that it was impenetrable, so that the argument was so interconnected you couldn't actually pull it apart, and you could never put it back together in the same way, that it was always going to be a method of chance to be able to even put it together in such a way that it would hold up and be structurally sound. But it was also to speak about the fact that always at the source of this creativity is going to be both, and that at the highest level, both are in action. So I thought I'd just share with you the making of the piece as well. It's a 1-minute time lapse that the project actually, it was one of those crazy things where the location of the sculpture changed 3 weeks before we installed. And so it required that we, instead of building it on site, which would have made more the element of chance a kind of public viewing. We did it at the studio and had to crate it all in one piece and lift it to the second story terrace where it was going to be installed. And there is no mapping of it either, so it's always going to be a kind of intuitive process putting these together. Oh, it's a secret. It took 7 years from design and negotiation with the museum to installation. But no, it happened, Caleb, in about a week. Yeah. Everything was done before and everything was staged, and then it was all based on a deadline. Yeah. So, but it worked. It worked really well.
Did you have to take any part of it apart in order to, it was all added?
Yeah, it was constructed as a complete composition, and then it was wire tied together, or what do you call those, snap ties? Yeah, zip ties together, and then crated in a box. That steel platform from which we built it was also the bottom of the crate, so that everything was able not to have to move until we lifted it onto the building. Yeah. And I close my portion of this with the most recent project, and one that is now, other ones are in process, and it takes about a year to realize these. It's in the experimental stage, and the reason why I wanted to include these is to speak about also the materials that are being used in this factory and that I have access to. These are materials that have, they're the most expensive, the highest quality of any alloy anywhere in the world, and they're made in a kind of proprietary way so that whether it's a defense contract or something for a particular manufacturer, it's something that has, it has a pricelessness to it in this factory. It's a material that's only used for a specific purpose. It can't be bought, it can't be traded, but inside that world it has a huge value. And I have to pinch myself every time I'm there because it still results in scrap that then I can buy and then work with. And so these are the highest quality stainless steel in the world. And what I was interested in is trying to discover the individual grain pattern, the dendritic grain that is inherent in the material when it's first manufactured. So when an ingot is cast, it is poured in liquid state in a mold, and it's cooled very, very slowly. And in that process, it develops a grain structure that is imperceptible to the naked eye once the material is being worked with. But if it goes through a series of stresses, kind of like meteoritic iron coming into our atmosphere, where it's in a super chilled state, once it reaches our atmosphere, it superheats, and it begins shedding skin, and it contracts and expands multiple times while it's entering into the environment where it'll land, whether it's on land or in the sea. And that's what I was trying to replicate with these, was to find something as individual as a fingerprint, the kind of fractal geometry that that allows what appears to be a homogeneous kind of material to have all the individuality that you would feel in a fingerprint. And so that leads us to Africa in a kind of strange circuitous route, but it has to do with the fact that iron, this lateritic soil that you see represented in this kind of rusty band in Africa, in West Africa and North Africa, is there because of a symbiotic relationship with the very first life form that fed on carbon dioxide in the air and iron sulfide in the sea. And this was before any land mass had formed. It was a process that took 2.5 billion years to occur. But in this process, the byproduct was oxygen. So the cyanobacteria, this blue-green algae, would feed on the iron particles in the sea, ingest carbon dioxide from the air, produce oxygen as a byproduct. And we owe our lives and all living, breathing entities in this planet owes our life to this symbiotic relationship between the very first life form and iron. And it's why iron is in our blood. It's an oxygenating agent that allows us to breathe more efficiently, and it's all because of this. So this satellite image is also of West Africa as well, and you can see a bloom of that kind of blue-green algae forming inside the water. And what happened when oxygen then was introduced is that the iron particles in the sea rusted. And those iron particles then settled onto the ocean floor in these colorful bands of hematite and magnetite that makes up the iron-banded formations that are mined to the tune of 1,500 million metric tons a year that produces all of the iron that we use in the world. So it was, in some ways, no surprise to me that when I began investigating and reading and learning what has been written and studied about blacksmiths in Africa, and finding out firsthand during my own visits and interviews and research on the continent over the last 7, 8 years, most recently my travels, that it was really relatively no surprise to recognize that the forging of iron was looked at as a procreative process, that it was tied to basically the blood of the earth, that there were this massive metaphor that in the mining and forging of, and smelting of iron rather, that it was looked at as a process by which the earth gave up this vital material. It went through a process of transformation that was in some ways kind of magic too, where earth, air, fire, and water were joined to be able to create this material. Blacksmiths held a very revered place within these communities for the technology that they harnessed. And the smelting process, as you can see here on the right-hand slide, where there's a chokwe earthen furnace that is, we call it a gynecomorphic furnace. It's in the shape of a female torso with breasts, womb, birth canal, and the entire smelting process is one that was looked at as this gestation process. The smiths were considered midwives, that the bloom that was forming on the inside of the furnace chamber was looked at as a fetus, and it was birthed with the same kind of ceremony that a child would be born into a family. So learning these things over the last several decades just reconfirmed my own depth of acknowledgement of the kind of debt that I owe to this material that plays such an important role in our lives. Even to the degree you can see the anatomical attributes of the hammer on the left, which is in a phallic form as well. Many of the hammers were looked at as father. The anvil was mother because she was planted in the ground. So there was the fertility aspect that allowed the anvil to work in combination with this phallic formed hammer to be able to create offspring in between. So even the forging of the iron was looked at as another level of procreative process, whereby everything that was forged between those surfaces was considered a child that would do good or bad in the world. I mean, not just those kind of polarity, but the blacksmith can produce the best tool available in that community, but that tool can still be used to maim someone, for instance. It can be used for ill will, and that as the blacksmith becomes the facilitator, he must stand at the forge and take responsibility for what it is that he's bringing into the world, what he's birthing into that community. So the bellows, you can see also the anatomical attributes there, are clearly implied. Even the figurative shape of some of the bellows forms too imply this male-female aspect that is so essential in completing the metaphor. So when the bloom is delivered, community members come. This is a Senefo smelting operation that produces about a 90-pound bloom, which is kind of the the average scale of the bloom that up until the 1970s was still produced in some regions in Africa. In Burkina Faso, for instance, there were still smelting happening there even as late as 1974 when this photograph was taken. And on the left are community members standing around the steaming vapor of the bloom. So the bloom, you have to imagine, also was more valuable than gold. It facilitated everything that was key in an agrarian community where farming tools were needed on a daily basis, and as a result, that iron bloom represented everything that was possible to be able to support that community. And so the vapor coming off of it was thought of as also life force. They call it Nyama, in a Mande word known among the Bamana and the Dogon peoples, Mande speakers, called Nyama, life force. And they ingest it, they inhale it. People that are ill would come to be able to have it waft over their bodies and for its healing properties. The first process of refining the bloom is done in a forge where the bars, or the bloom rather, is consolidated into a homogeneous mass that shows not only the quality of the material, because the grain aligns and it becomes a very rigid bar, but it still shows the sponge-like mass on the side, which you'll see in some of the currency up at the Santa Fe Institute. But the process of working it in the same way as the farmer would work with the hoe, and that would impart value into the material. It was also conceived that as the blacksmith forged, that also enhanced the value of the material that was being worked on. So here you see the process of the bloom at the top, a refined bar in the middle, and then 19th century currency bars made in exactly the same way, called dubil, made in Nigeria by the Magoli peoples. One thing I might just mention here too quickly is that you may think that working with stone hammers and stone anvils is somehow a kind of backward technology, and part of my study there is to recognize how efficient those systems are, because it's basalt. It doesn't rob the heat from the iron, so it's a much more efficient process. The fire being in the ground allows a kind of insulative quality to always direct the heat towards the center of the fire, so it really makes the fire, they use less fuel, the iron gets hotter faster, so it's a very efficient system for working material. They can outforge my machines any day. This is Ide Esasema and Kao Kosi, who are cabre smiths working in the northern part of Togo, where there's some 250 families living in this town between Chare and Kude, where we were spending the summer a few years ago. So one of the first things a smith makes with the bloom is a hoe, which you can see a Senefo hoe on the left, but on the right is a hoe-like shape made in an abstracted form that's used as a dance blade during girls' initiation ceremonies. So it would be a hoe-like shape that was paraded in public, similarly to the Matakam girls here that are going through a rite of passage during the advancement of puberty. And this sickle-like shape was never meant to harvest grain, but it was made in an abstracted form that they then dance with to speak about the fecundity of their time on this planet as well, and the desire to have families and to populate the world with additional children. So valuable were the acknowledgement of the tools that the tool forms were used in lots of different ritual ways as well. So here's a Dan mask that the headdress is completely covered with stylized miniature forms of all the farming tools, blacksmithing tools, tools that were required to be able to allow this community to prosper. There's probably 60 different recognizable miniatures on this mask alone. And likewise, these same kinds of tool forms become the currency for healing. This is Nkondi from the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's carved by a Yambe sculptor and cared for by an Nganga, a priest who takes care of this sculptural object, and supplicants come from the village that have some ailment or some problem that needs addressing. They bring with them a piece of iron that then he drives into the object to be able to allow the iron to be like a conduit for the power that's embodied inside this ritual object. Really striking. Conduit, iron being a conduit for action in the world. Even to the degree, too, that among the Yoruba in Nigeria, this is an Orisha Oko staff. It's a representation of a deity called Oko. And she is made from worn-out hose, supposedly in the village of Irwawo, where the blacksmiths make this ritual object. It's like a tall staff that is used during the planting cycle, brought out several times for public events, but cared for by the elder women in the community. And it's entirely forged from these hose and has the representation of a male aspect on the top with the phallus and the seeds on the ferrule that holds the wooden part to the iron part below. It also is this mixed pair of male and female. So you have the male on the upper portion, the female on the lower portion, but their heads merge in the middle. So you can see on the right-hand side, you have two heads morphed into one, so you have two pairs of eyes, you have two noses represented, the necks and shoulders and body extending out beyond that. Really critical, in terms of understanding the importance and the value of iron inside that community. And it's because it stands in for the entire agricultural endeavor. The reason these forms, which are special use currencies used in very limited spheres of exchange, why they have value is because in that community everyone recognizes the importance that farming plays in a culture that 85% of the population is farming to this day. And even now, though these currencies are no longer used in common practice, they still are a store of material that are occasionally brought to the smith and made into something else. I included these because it goes kind of from the smallest to the largest. So the ones on the right are made by Chamba smiths in Cameroon, and as you can see from the quarter sitting next to it, some are just very, very tiny. The ones on the left are a type that are among the largest hoe currencies in the continent. Some stand over 4 feet tall and weigh even up to 100 pounds. And those too are made from fragments of hose put together in a patchwork quilt. So it's not just the material, but it's all of the labor that went into the farming endeavor before those hose wore out. It's the labor employed by the smith who puts them together in this patchwork arrangement. It's the labor of the smelter who brought the material to them at the very beginning. And each stage along that process, that object accrues in value. It becomes valuable to the degree that it can only be used in certain spheres. It can't just be taken to the market and traded off for a few hens or something. It really is a very dramatic exchange token. These are other examples. The one on the right is a quele object. It's a combination of a spear shape and also an axe form. The top shape is like an axe from the Kwele who live in Gabon. On the left is the Mambila hoe shape, which is a morphing of two different hoe forms made into this kind of figurative design. When Europeans first came to Africa, they also saw how valuable these commodities were, that iron and other metal had more value than gold, more value than silver. Those materials were thought to be very weak, and they weren't plentiful enough to be able to satisfy the growing desire or need for these kinds of materials. So iron had a much higher value than silver, for instance, and Europeans capitalized on on that because we know the rest of the story. But as far as the kinds of currencies that are represented in this exhibition and in this slideshow now, Europeans realized that they could copy those same indigenous forms and do them in such a way that they mass-produce those objects. You can see the European stamp on the right-hand side. It's almost an identical shape to one used in Uganda. And at the museum in Antwerp, the Ethnography Museum, there were two examples that I found just a few years ago. The ones in the middle are replicants of the indigenous forms that flank it on either side, one Kwele on the right and Fang on the left, both from Gabon. But the thing that's interesting about the Fang piece is that this is what financed Livingstone's trip through Africa. When he went, he brought bundles and bundles of dupa, which is this hoe-like shape. Had he not had that, he most likely would never have made it. He would have either been decapitated for having, maybe, well, I won't get into it. But the point is that sometimes food isn't enough, sometimes cloth isn't enough, sometimes the other kinds of valuable objects, beads and other commodities that one might travel with in that time to be able to exchange and have the liquidity of being able to travel with these trade goods wasn't enough. And he realized very early on from the failed attempts of people before him that iron was the only way to lubricate that traveling process. So important too were the tools of the blacksmith, that they were sometimes represented on royal stools, thrones actually, that were used in, this is in the Benin kingdom, and I think this dates from the 17th century. It's in the museum in Berlin, the State Museum, and really remarkable carving. Emblems of authority were also represented as a kind of display of wealth among the royal family members or kings or chieftains within these larger empires. They would display these kinds of blades that not only were made kind of state-of-the-art in that moment of the highest level of craftsmanship and skill to be able to produce these shapes, but also to speak about the rarity of certain materials that were applied to it, the embellishment with all the engraving and the chasing. As I had mentioned before, that accrues value onto the piece as well. These are throwing knives that were an African invention. This is known nowhere else in the world. It's a different kind of process than the boomerang in Australia, for instance, and it was made of wood. But these iron throwing knives were meant to cut from all surfaces. They were also meant to go around corners. If a person was holding a shield, it was designed so that it would hook on the edge of the shield and catch the person from the backside. Ingenious and lethal at the same time. So important were they to warfare and the domination of certain kingdoms in that region, and to control the same kinds of resources that we as Westerners value inside our own borders and the borders of other international entities. It was recognized that an abstracted form of the throwing knife could be one of the most important trade goods that a royal family member could use. This is an oshelay made by Dengese smiths, also in the DRC, and a remarkable piece. Made too delicate to throw, too large. It's over 34 inches high. Another type of spear currency called Liganda, made by the Topoke in the Democratic Republic of Congo, used as a bride wealth currency. Copper currencies that originated in the form of bracelets that were these spiral shapes made from forged copper. Here's an example made by the Obolo in the inland Niger Delta of Nigeria. This one dates from the 18th century, but is made from one piece of copper forged out probably I think it could be 16, 18 feet long, folded back against itself in three ways, and then twisted and then spiraled into this coil. Remarkable technology to be able to produce that shape. It would be a part of a royal treasury. So it would be the gold bullion of the king who possessed these objects. It's another type of currency that transcended both the value tied up in the material that was never intended to be worn, but in this case it has the value of the material because it's large, it's copper, and it can be worn. It would be worn by people who didn't have to work in the field, so it was a display of privilege, showing that their status inside the society, they had others working for them, and that they could parade through their daily lives in such a way that they enhance their beauty in the same way as the jewelry that we find on our bodies does now in our worlds. Another type of copper ingot made by the same people, the Mbole in the DRC, but embellished with stylized forms of engraving. Other kinds of anklets, the Kutu women on the right have a fiber ring that holds up this 20-pound anklet that would have been offered at when they were married, but is brought out and worn during certain ceremonial events, or this was most likely a staged photograph for the person that made this image, but there are many accounts of people being decked out with all their finery for different kinds of community events and gatherings. Along with the Europeans came the desire for human labor, and the foremost currency during that era really were the materials that were most desired by the kingships, by the smiths that were producing pieces out of iron or bronze. And so there were a type of manila that was produced in Europe. So the English, the Spanish, the Portuguese all had a form that they then traded wherever their colonial interests were. And that those objects ended up facilitating the slave trading that is now an historic event that was in part also facilitated by the thirst and the desire, the unquenchable thirst really for these kinds of material resources. And it was both that desire that brought about this kind of horrific chapter in our lives. And blacksmiths, again, were at the source of that desire. And we owe a lot, I think, to the fact that this material was what lubricated this mass exodus out of Africa during those days. And at the same time, the European interests, the colonial interests, had to devalue the indigenous currencies to be able to introduce coinage and paper money in exchange. So by 1920, almost all the furnaces producing indigenous smelted iron had ceased production because of the illegal aspect of it. It was not unlike what happened in the New England area where before our separation from England, England wanted to produce the iron. They wanted it to be shipped as an exclusive product that we then had to buy on this side of the Atlantic. They didn't want us to have our own smelting operations. And so it's the first wave of destabilization that happens in a colonial environment. And this was the case in every one of the colonial provinces throughout the entire continent. So what you see here are abandoned furnaces. This is Cape Coast, one of the slave castles that was abandoned in the late 19th century. But I didn't want to leave this on a low note. I also wanted to speak about what's happening a little bit in Africa right at the moment, where the material resources are being extracted from points all over the world. So the scrap material that's coming in, even though indigenously smelted iron is no longer the case, iron is being brought in many different forms. Ingenious blacksmiths are figuring out ways to satisfy and solve the desires of their own communities to be able to produce objects that are needed inside these places. So in this case, you can see on the lower side, Kaukosi had just finished forging a hoe shape, which is on the lower end, but that same abstracted form of hoe then becomes a musical instrument that has this kind of bivalve construction that he was making for a ceremony that we also documented called Wa, which is the end of a 4-stage initiation for young men that is the last phase of their passage into adulthood. And this gong called Ekpande is played by them during this 5-day event that happens day and night through these mountain villages in the northern part of Togo. So with that, I close with an object that was carved by a Yoruba smith. It's a Gelede mask, and it's a mask that has on its top, the crown is a tableau of a blacksmith shop, showing the kind of universal importance. The way it's revered is almost another world. It's a tablature that the community inside this place where the Gelede would be danced would recognize each one of the actors, each one of the participants in the forge, and a key element in terms of how a community prospers. It really is, if one were to imagine the analogy of blood and iron kind of resurfacing again in the metaphorical thread that's run through this talk, you could imagine that blacksmiths are really at the source of that kind of circulatory system and provide the things that hold value inside this community. So thanks. I know that was a lot of speaking, but I wanted to try to impart what I feel is a deep-rooted sense of where value lies inside these objects that might otherwise have been taken for granted. So thank you for your patience. I appreciate that. Yes.
In your first slide, you showed us an iron piece that had been crafted and found at the flea market. And you told us a lot about it. Did you know that at the time that you saw it? Was the dealer able to give you some of the background?
Yeah, no, I didn't know anything about it, and that's what was so intriguing. I knew it was a piece of iron that had held intrigue, for me. The person I bought it from was a Soninke trader from Gambia, who was one of the guys selling beads, and he happened to have a little bit of these other kinds of artifacts with him, and he told me that it was currency. And at the time, Ekpo Eyo had just written a book on the history of Nigerian currency, and I picked up a copy of that book, and in it he speaks about Tajari, and so it was just this unfolding of a kind of lifetime's work. It's a whole other world for me. It's like another hat that I wear, but yeah. Yes.
I know this is a little off your subject. Is there any record of people giving a special value to meteoritic iron in Africa and revering something made from it? It's very, very special.
Mm-hmm. I haven't, in my travels and research, haven't actually encountered meteoritic iron being forged. There are anvils that were used where meteoritic iron was placed inside the workshop and was used as a working surface. The only examples that come to mind are in Egypt. There's a very famous dagger that was unearthed in one of Tutankhamun's tombs that was forged from meteoritic iron. The advantage to meteoritic iron is that it has a lot of nickel in it, so the nickel content keeps it from rusting as much as would be just a carbon, a ferrous material without the nickel added to it. So, but I don't have any examples of it, even though you would imagine that there would be, that would be the first source of material to be worked. Do you know of any examples, Emery? No. Yeah.
You mentioned there is one dagger in the Freer Museum in Washington. If you happen to be there, ask your way to it, although it comes with you.
Ah, yeah, right.
Tom, could you repeat the question?
So the question was wondering whether I had ever encountered any artifacts made from meteoritic iron, whether there was, where any of these travels had exposed blacksmiths using that material as the only naturally occurring iron on the planet. Maybe you all are aware of this, but iron doesn't occur naturally. It has to go through the smelting process. It's just, it's an ore mixed in a matrix of all kinds of other impurities that have to melt away from it to be able to coagulate into this sponge-like mass that we call a bloom, to be able to forge a, something that has integrity. Otherwise, it would have weak inclusions in it. And meteoritic iron is the only source of naturally occurring iron on the planet.
Well, a question. Did you ever get a chance to try your hand using the African techniques and materials? And if so, talk a little bit about what the experience was like.
Yeah. Well, yes, I have. Everywhere that I've traveled, there's kind of a rite of passage that I also have to go through. And I'm not there to teach techniques. I'm not there to change anything. I'm there to observe and to participate for a time as a colleague, as a person who also understands those same skills, that speaks the same language, that has understands the same techniques to be able to evaluate what's going on in front of me. So to answer your question, there's a rite of passage in that information really isn't parted until they see that I'm able to forge. They don't believe it at first. And the first time that I was given a hammer, and they were making these small hoes, and so I watched the process for probably a day and a half or so. And this was with an anthropologist, Henry Druel, who I was traveling with, and they asked Henry, he's not really a blacksmith, he's a white guy, there's no way in hell he's going to be a blacksmith. And so they asked him if he would ask me if I would forge for them. They didn't want to ask me directly because they thought it would be embarrassing, because they wanted to give me the chance to decline. And instead, I forged what they had forged in front of me. And the first hammer blows it was just like this uproar, total laughter. Everybody just like falling down laughter, the three guys that were in the shop. And pretty soon there was about 40, maybe 50 people. All the family was there. Everyone was there that was within hollering distance to watch this white guy sweat while he's working at the forge, because they had never seen it. They had never seen this is terrible, but it's true. They had never seen a white person sweat working with their hands. Not a woodworker, not a potter, not a blacksmith, not a weaver. Nobody with hand skills in that context, at least in this small neighborhood. And so it was the kind of laughter that was, you've got to see it to believe it. And it was immediately changed the whole dynamic in terms of, then they're able to see the burn marks on my hands, my arms, my chest, where sparks have flown in over the years. And that kind of camaraderie is something that I'll never forget. I mean, never. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Great story.
But it hurts. I can tell you that the not being used to the kind of the club type hammer is very difficult on the wrist if you're not used to forging with it. Working on the ground also is a very tricky thing for a person who's stood up all of my life working at the forge. So there were those kinds of hurdles that one had to go over. But what I realized in working in that situation with a 3-point kind of connection between the fire, the water source, and the anvil, you have this geometry that is so ergonomically perfectly laid out that the smith has only this, this basically quarter turn within his body's reach to be able to manipulate the material in the most efficient way. You don't waste any time taking a hot bar from the fire, bringing it to the anvil. You waste no time taking it from the anvil to the quench tub. You waste no time. The bellows operator, where he is just far enough away that he's shielded from the heat and is able to, oh, that's another thing about the bellows design that is so cool. It is 2 chambers, and it has 2 tubes that run down towards what's called the tuer, where the fire rests. There's a little conical ceramic nozzle on the end that directs the air to the center of the fire. And the way that the animal skin that covers the pot works is that as the bellows operator is raising them up and down, it's sucking warm air from the fire into that chamber, mixing it with the cool air, and then directing it in this kind of shimmying process down towards the fire. And as a result, it's preheating the air to maybe 350, 400 degrees by the time it reaches the fire, which means, again, it takes less time to heat it, and it's much, much more efficient, less fatigue on the bellows operator, and it's something that Europeans didn't figure out for some 300 years after African smiths had designed that method of preheating air. For some of you history buffs, the Industrial Revolution wouldn't have happened when it happened if Abraham Darby hadn't figured out that you have to preheat the air to get the furnace temperatures up high enough to smelt iron. And yet in Africa, where we now, through the archaeological record, believe that perhaps ironworking was independently invented there, the smelting of iron.
Wait, no, let's unless someone else has a question. Okay, this is fantastic. I think what it demonstrates beautifully is when we talk about complexity, we're not just talking about algorithms and mathematics, but deep symbolic cultural history. And so I'm very appreciative of you bringing that to the Santa Fe Institute. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.